make sure that it's where it's supposed to be. Go live. Are we live? It looks like we're live. Alright, back here, make sure the audio is working. Cool. Open this up again, and it brings it down for some reason. Love the way that works. Okay. So, for you online folks, we're starting a little late. I was passing out all the tests. And just to quickly run down for you guys, you all have your grades on Blackboard, so you should have that settled. If you're not happy with your grade, actually I haven't even looked through the grades, I just graded them, and Blackboard took care of everything else. Yeah, I dropped the lowest, so as long as you do your papers and the rest of your tests, I can drop the first test grade if you're not happy with the first test grade. First paper is due in a week. 2 to 3 pages, double space, preferably a Word document. I'd prefer you not to link a Google Doc or Google Docs to me, because sometimes that gets a little bit weird, and it makes me send you another email in response to your email to get permission to view the first email, and that gets lost in the shuffle really quickly. So just attach a Word document or a PDF or something to the initial email, please. Yeah, so that's in a week. I think that's everything. Right, and after we're on chapter 4 now, once we get done with chapter 6, that'll be the next test. So we got a little while yet, so everything's cool. Great. Let's continue. This is where we ended. I'm going to turn this over so I don't even look at it. We ended with the limits of patriarchal order. What women were up to here in, let's see, yeah, here in North America, and how even if things were amicable, divorce was hard because you had to go to the city council, and at least in the northern colonies, most of these city councils were run by the church leaders, and most of these church leaders were Puritan, and that was hard to do. Morning. Let me get your name real quick. Make sure I get you on the roll. Sir? Hey, Aiden, yeah, I've got your test up here. Mr. Dowdy. I mean, you might have seen it on Blackboard already, but just in case, here. If you got any questions, let me know. All right. And then I had this image, which again we'll see again a little bit later, but in a different form. With all of this underneath. These were big, they called them broadsides, almost like posters. They had all this extra writing underneath, which this isn't a big enough quality to see. I do like how it goes from, what is this, 2 to, oh, it's actually, is that 90? See, I thought it was 50 initially, but the middle one's 50. Wow, that's giving them a whole lot of credit for 1700s. Okay. Right. So on to the economy of the day. So population began to grow. Again, I'm going to give you some years and numbers, which will of course not be on the test, but I'm just wanting to show you the speed at which this stuff was happening. So it's in 1700, which is going to be our starting point for a lot of this. Population in New England was about 250,000, and within 25 years it had doubled. And by 1775, it had jumped to 2.5 million. That's a substantial increase, I mean, just percentage-wise. Doubling in 25 years, and in another 50 years, I mean, going up by a factor of, 5? From 500,000 to 2.5 million. Now, this wasn't just because they were having a lot of babies, and those babies weren't immediately dying. I mean, we did talk last time about how women would often die in childbirth, but that was happening less often as time was progressing, again, especially in New England. And also the children were dying less often, again, especially in New England. But also they were getting a lot of immigration. And also the imported slave labor, that was more so in the South in terms of population, but the North also had slaves. Not going to pretend there was some line of demarcation where the slaves just stopped existing. But you needed them far less than, say, New Hampshire. You weren't exactly growing fields of tobacco in New Hampshire. But as the population is growing, there's less opportunity for people to get their own land, start their own business, because everything is sort of already owned. And the people who did already have land weren't necessarily winning everything. They weren't doing a very good job of maintaining the soil, so it didn't take long for them to just wear out the land that they were living on. We're going to see that later as well, especially when cotton takes hold, because that's not very good for the soil. And rather than crop rotation, or really they didn't even know about using fertilizer, they just wore out the soil and would just move west. Obviously, they were also being attacked by hostile natives, because the natives don't want them there because they're using the land that used to belong to the natives. And also, as they're heading further west, they're running into French and Spanish settlers who also don't want them there. In the Middle Atlantic, so like the Chesapeake region, folks were moving from the farmlands because they didn't have any land. You can't really survive in an area that you'd have to farm without any land to farm. Into the cities to try to find fortune, or at least not starve. However, as more and more people moved into the cities to try to find jobs, the job market became more crowded, and therefore it became harder to find jobs in the cities. So at the time, tobacco was, again, the most valuable product. Even as we'd seen before, at some point the price did stagnate, but it was still pound for pound the most valuable product. And if you were a small landowner, to put it simply, when it came to farming back then, and really even now, when it comes to people trying to farm on anything that's less than 1,000 acres, you would basically take out a loan to buy the seed to grow your crop for the year, and hope that you manage to make a profit at the end of that year, which is to say that the market stayed stable, so that whatever you managed to harvest and sell made you more money than what you borrowed to begin with so that you could pay back your loan and also make a little bit of profit to survive and then start over the next year. If that harvest were to fail, that loan would mean you'd lose your home and farm and everything. So it was bad times for small farmers. So the larger landowners were usually the ones that ran everything, especially in the South. The planters, which is to say, like the plantation owners, the slave owners, the big conglomerates, they controlled pretty much everything. The businesses, the trade, even the politics. They were the ones that were running for office. Bless you. The ones that were making laws that benefited their big businesses. You know, certainly not like today where people with money are the ones making the laws to benefit the ones with the money. Not at all. So we've got population density of the day. Again, the Chesapeake region, and then up into New England. And then as far as the yellow there, it's basically Charleston and Savannah, and then much more sparse as you get out into the boonies. Actually, next semester we'll talk about where the word the Boondocks came from. It's actually kind of horrific. It's from a war we don't ever talk about. Anyway, so here's the population of the Chesapeake colonies. You see the white population going up, and after, the early 1700s, the black population is going up. And notice the native population just completely bottoming out because, genocide tends to do that. Right. What? Oh, okay. The book has this weird, piece of art in it, and it's called the Fraktur Birth and Baptismal Certificate, and I hadn't really looked at it before, but it's some kind of elaborate form of German folk art, which, considering the amount of German immigrants, that makes sense. Right. So there were lots of immigrants besides just English that were showing up, plenty of Irish and Scottish, Germans and Swedes as well, and then, of course, the African slaves that were forced across the Atlantic. And I don't care what Ben Carson says, they were not immigrants, they were enslaved laborers being forced across the Atlantic. That's not an immigrant. Freaking weirdo. So as the established colonies are increasing in population and it's becoming harder to, create a farm or really even find a job, many of these immigrants are pushing west, dealing with hostile natives, and then also the Spanish and French settlers who are also going to be hostile because they don't want anything to do with the English settlers, even if by English we mean Irish, Scottish, German, or Swedish. However, a fair number of these settlers heading west did actually negotiate to some degree with the natives to attain their land. They weren't really connected in any major way with the governments back east. They were kind of on their own and didn't have the backing of some, colonial militia. So like, okay, well, let's get along with the natives and work with them to have farmland out here. Still, though, it tended to be blurry about where, the colonial land ended and the native land began, especially out on the frontier. I mean, it was blurry about where one frontier, where one colonial holding began and the other, or where one ended and the other began, because, it's all imaginary lines. Property lines are weird anyway. In the early 1700s, though, a flood of Scots-Irish began pouring west due to bad harvests and overwhelmed this equilibrium that had been set up by earlier settlers. Also, William Penn had died, and he had been a major proponent of maintaining this balance between the needs of the natives and the needs of the Pennsylvania settlers. So again, when we're talking about the frontier, we're talking about like middle Pennsylvania. We're certainly not talking about, Nevada. That comes later. So yeah, again, he had maintained the balance. However, after he passed, his sons and advisors were not able to keep that going. And then when the flood of immigrants came in, it completely overwhelmed any attempt of keeping the settlers and natives to keep the balance. And needless to say, the settlers were coming there in larger numbers, and things were going to go how things always go between settlers and natives in North America. Or really anywhere Europeans get involved. So we have some of the groups here: Africans, Germans, Scots, Irish, and Scots down in Charleston. British colonists largely in Chesapeake. And then in Philadelphia, lots of Germans. That's where you have the Philadelphia Dutch. They say Dutch because Americans are terrible at understanding things, but there's a large German population in Pennsylvania, and really even spreading westward. I took the train west, and there's a lot of Amish, like from Pennsylvania just west, and the Amish speak German. I don't know if it's as a primary language, but they speak German. And it seems like they speak it conversationally between themselves. And it was strange, like riding the train, and it was like large family because they have a lot of kids, and they're just like speaking German between each other and joking and laughing, and it's like, this is a little bit strange. That's not what I was expecting to be in like Midwest U.S. and having like families joking in German behind me. Like, I've been in Europe before, and that's what you'd expect, but like being in the middle of the U.S., like cornfields everywhere, and you've got some people joking in German behind you. It was an experience. Same map as before, just a little more detail. Again, this is showing that the frontier was not very far west. When we talk about the frontier, it's like here. It's not very far in. All right. So obviously, with the expansion, it led to conflict. But not just the conflict we've seen multiple times in the chapters so far, but also between these newly arrived settlers and somebody message me. Let's see if my mother needs me. I have a. Make sure I reply to this. It's an appointment for the cat. The one that I showed you guys earlier. Yes. No food after 10 p.m. Yeah, I'm gonna have to kidnap her and bring her inside. Right. So this wasn't just the natives and the settlers fighting, but the established settlers that have been there and the new immigrants coming in. One of the oldest concepts we have here in America is that the new, quote, new immigrants are somehow lazy, even though they tend to do the jobs that the older immigrants don't want to do. I don't know. It's a strange paradox. It's like, oh, they're coming in and taking our jobs, but also they're lazy. It's like, okay. Now, at the time, this could also be chalked up to the English being prejudiced against the Scots-Irish because they had been since England existed. So, 1066 and all that. Well, no, even before 1066, because that was just the French. So, several hundred years at least. Now, going back to Pennsylvania for a moment, there was this event, and I mean, it's in bold in the book, so I figured I'd need to mention it, known as the Walking Purchase. Using forged documents, this group claimed that William Penn had agreed to basically annex a much larger amount of land. Essentially, the amount of land that surveyors could walk off in a day and a half, and that will be given to the settlers as opposed to the natives. And of course, the surveyors knew the exact route they could take to get as much land as possible. So, some forged documents, some scheming and getting more land. Also, and this is going to cause the spark for the next section, these new immigrants also brought religious diversity because they weren't all Anglicans. I mean, the Irish sure as hell aren't Anglicans. The Scots tend to be Presbyterians. So, we've got religious diversity, and that's freaking out the English. And also, these new religious groups are changing how the settlers are treating natives, so the natives aren't necessarily being treated equally by the various groups now, even within the English colonies, and that's going to change how they perceive the English colonists. Groups like the Catholics and Jews came to America to try to escape religious persecution, which we'll get into later. And even among the enslaved Africans, despite how they were brought over, they tended to maintain their culture. Let me see if I can grab this in the book. Yep. Africans too brought new ideas and practices to North America. Transported by force from the unknown land, they may have found religious faith particularly important. Enslaved blacks included some Catholics from regions long held by Portuguese and a few thousand Muslims. but many Africans embraced religions that were largely unknown to their Anglo-American masters. Even those planters who allowed Protestants to minister to their slaves discovered that many Africans and African Americans retained beliefs and rituals handed down across generations. And it should be mentioned that, kind of like with the Native Americans, those who were proselytized to just took the ideas that they were given and were like, cool, we're just going to add this. Now, unlike with the Native Americans, who were just like, okay, here's all our gods, and we're just going to put yours in here with it, with them. A lot of the African theology just kind of like mixed, and it became a new thing every time something new was thrown in. It's fascinating, some of the different religious ideas and practices. Obviously, the Creole stuff in Louisiana is fascinating. You've got the stuff in the Caribbean, but it just seems like, you know, everywhere they were exposed to something different, something new came out. It's pretty cool. And even those that were like completely, air quotes here, completely converted to Christianity, they still made it their own thing. Like they had their own preachers and made it their own rituals, which of course the slave owners did not like. It was interesting. So again, we got the English, French, Spanish, Dutch and Swedes, you know, up there kind of in the middle. Here's the walking purchase. Again, like based on the whole area of Pennsylvania, it's not that much. But considering that Philadelphia is just like that, and it was supposed to just be what was along the river, but then they took all this land inland, and all of this over here was just an idea. You know, these lines weren't really drawn. That was a chunk of land that was taken by the walking purchase. Excuse me. So it took a day and a half to walk from Wrightson to Jim Thorpe. They just marked it off this way. All right. In the 30 minutes we have left, let's get into what I consider probably the biggest part of this chapter, because it really it kind of encapsulates all of this. And it was always talked about in my high school, but my high school was weird. Right. So with all this going on, worldly concerns, different religions coming to America, the British Protestant majority felt that their spiritual strength was wavering. Because, you know, when you're the ones that are in control forever, and then suddenly somebody else has some amount of power and freedom, you feel like you're oppressed. So this is actually, again, if you follow along in the book, this is like the intro section. This isn't even the first subheading, but this is the only part where they really talk about the new light clergy and the old light clergy. So I'm just going to include this. Right. So the new light clergy, my throat's still screwy. Basically, they wish to address this crisis, in air quotes for you online folks, head on, work together regardless of sect, as long as they were Protestant. So you had Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians and whatever working together. They weren't really concerned about denomination. the old light clergy tended to stick with their traditional way of doing things, their traditional denomination. Now, that said, they were still part of the Great Awakening. They were still part of this movement, and their old denominations did still grow, but they weren't what you think of if you think of the Great Awakening, because the new light clergy is where all the people going out and shouting and hollering and, as we're going to see, really getting in trouble came from. Because by the 1740s, there was actually a backlash against the revivalists. They were seen as having gone too far, and again, we'll get into that because one dude especially gets in a lot of trouble, and it's very funny because he's got a way with words. We'll just say. Hopefully we can get to him today. Maybe not, if we only have a bit of time left. Anyway, I was only able to find a couple of images for New Light Clergy and Old Light Clergy. It's not a super common term, apparently. I did find these two churches looking angry at each other. Some unfortunate art here on the New Light Clergy Church, though. That cross is a little bit, the ratio on it's a little bit off. Or somebody really doesn't like the New Light Clergy. And then also you can just steal somebody else's slide entirely, as I do. Rational appeal versus emotional appeal, educated ministry versus converted ministry. We're going to see a lot of that. And the main thing, which the book actually does go into detail, the established classes versus the dispossessed. So, well, we'll go into greater detail with that, but this is probably the most important part from this particular image. This is what's going to be in our notes. So, the things that led to the Great Awakening. I was about to say, what? This or the image? Okay. I was going to say what caused the Great Awakening, but that implies that it was, I don't know, some like great reaction to something. There were multiple things that led to the Great Awakening, you could say. The Enlightenment was certainly part of it. The cultural movement emphasized rational scientific thinking. But the Enlightenment was not anti-religious. The spreading of Enlightenment thought did create more acceptance for religious diversity, especially in the colonies, and in particular, as we're going to see in Chapter 6, most of our founding fathers were Enlightenment thinkers, but they weren't like anti-theists. In fact, they were theists. They or deists, rather. Deist is the proper term. It was this more rational view, or they believed this more rational view of like things we can't understand. It wasn't like the Puritans where everything that happens is a sign from God. Like you drop your pen on the floor, it's like, oh, God knocked the pen out of my hand because he's angry at me. Like their belief was, we don't know how the universe started. Therefore, God created the universe. The idea is the clockmaker God. God created the universe, set it into motion, and left us to our own devices. And everything that we do from this point on is up to us. Now, obviously, there were plenty that didn't agree with this. There were the Pietists, this German sect that challenged the Enlightenment ideas. And I'd never heard of the Pietists before creating these notes. And the Pietists never show up again. they apparently didn't have a whole lot going on, but their ideas stuck around. So their ideas were, they opposed the power of established churches, push power to follow their heart rather than their head in spiritual matters, no thinky, only feel, apparently. And they affected the Presbyterians, Huguenots, Anglicans, and Methodists going forward. So again, the Pietists themselves weren't super important, but their thoughts were used by later groups that did stick around. I don't know if Pietists are still a thing. This is another thing we'll see. I don't think this semester. It might be next. I feel like it's next semester. Where it's just like a group of farmers that get together for like community and helping each other out, and then by the end they're like this major political power that eventually dies out, but all their ideas end up getting picked up by major political parties. So like the actual group just goes away, but all their ideas end up being major issues that the big political parties pick up and run on. So that's what this is. This group just kind of disappears, but their ideas get used in the Great Awakening. From 1700, laymen and ministers both were concerned about the lack of clergy, and the few colleges in the colonies, we had Harvard and the College of William and Mary, emphasized learned discourse over passion. How dare you go to college to learn things? You should go to college to feel things. I don't know. So then we had reverends such as this fellow that I'm going to be angry about having to say his name more than once in my life. Theodorus Frelinghuysen, I guess. And William Tennant, who I will actually use his name more than once because that's not a hard name to say. They worked together and basically created this standard view of religious conversion. Individuals had to be convinced of their sinful nature, experience a spiritual rebirth, and then behave piously as evidence of the conversion actually having happened. I mean, there's more to this. The book goes into more detail. There we go. Frelinghuysen was Dutch, so that makes sense. Anyway, they started the wave of revivals that would eventually lead to the big thing. And when I say revivals, it was mostly like this. Like, you'd get a dude that would find a place that was kind of off the ground, and he'd do his preaching. You didn't have mega churches. You didn't have even really amphitheaters around. Not here in the colonies. Amphitheaters were really Roman, if I remember right. Well, no, they were built in Italy during the Renaissance, or at least during the Enlightenment. None here, though. Not until the 1800s, I think. So, let's get into the main guy for the Enlightenment. And that's George Whitefield. So he was inspired by John Wesley, who founded Methodism, which is weird because I was raised Methodist and they're real chill. And it's weird to think that the guy who was the main head of the Great Awakening was inspired by the guy who created Methodism. I don't know. And Methodist is a derogatory term because, of course, the British did it. The people who followed John Wesley were derided for, oh, you're only doing the methods of salvation. You're not really actually, don't really have the heart for it or whatever. So you're just a bunch of Methodists. Like, oh yeah, we like that term. We'll use it. So it's a British thing of being insulted and then deciding you like the insult. I don't know. The British are weird. Anyway, George Whitefield's claim to fame is that he used the lines of communication and travel, which typically were used for moving money around, to spread his word. So he went from where he was based in Britain to North America 7 times during his career. In one of these tours between 1739 and 1740, he made 350 stops in a single year. Well, between 39 and 40, drawing crowds as large as 20,000 at a time when Boston's population was 17,000. That's a lot. I mean, when one of the largest cities in the colonies has a population less than the crowds this guy's pulling, there's a lot going on. Well, I'll finish the slide before I ask the question. Whitefield and others like him tended to focus less on denomination and more on the core beliefs and the passionate preaching, which, like I said, was the big draw of the Great Awakening. It was the big ideas, the passionate preaching. And as we said, the people who went to these tended to be disenfranchised. A lot of the churches were wealthy. You had to pay rent to sit near the front, apparently. And they were invigorated by these large outdoor revivals. So many new people were brought to religion by these revivals, and people who were already Christian felt born again by the fiery speeches. And as I said, a lot of these were interdenominational, but actually the larger number tended to stick within their own denomination. But there still was a large re-energizing, wow, use your words, re-energizing of religion within the colonies. So even for those that weren't spreading out and just pulling everybody in, there was a lot of new energy in the colonies for religion. Okay, so again, here's George Whitefield. Now this is showing a very small crowd. This is important because it's got a dog. But when we've got a crowd of 20,000, and it's just a dude standing up on a box, how does a crowd of 20,000 hear a dude standing on a box? Because obviously, we didn't have any kind of sound equipment. And as I said, there were no amphitheaters because that was a way to naturally, cause the sound to echo out and be louder, which is a cool bit of engineering. But in a situation like this where you're just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, how are you going to get 20,000 people to hear a speech? You're halfway there. I mean, one guy could only yell so loud. What you do, let's go back to this picture. Imagine that crowd is many people deep. What you do is they had an idea of how far his voice would carry, and at about a distance where it would start to get up too quiet, you'd have a person standing there, and he'd have his back to Whitefield and be facing the crowd further out, and then he would repeat what Whitefield said, yell it out further into the crowd. And if the crowd was really big, they'd have another one further out. It'd be a relay system. So, kind of like speakers, where, it essentially repeats what you say, but at least for our speaker systems, it's supposed to be immediate, but sometimes it isn't. And they would just have a relay system of repeating what the speaker is saying. So it's an 18th century speaker system. All right, let's get a little further in. I think we might be able to finish this section. And then we can do the political, I think the political awakenings is the last. Yeah, and then we can finish the chapter next week, because today's Wednesday. All right. So initially, the Great Awakening had a lot of support. Religion had been in decline. Now it was getting a big boost. However, the core factor of the Great Awakening was the critique of the educated clergy and established norms, which obviously didn't sit well with the educated clergy and established norms. Also, women slaves and natives were welcomed into the revivals and encouraged to partake in mostly equal measure with the men, which upset a lot of folks, especially in the South. And then we have my favorite dude, James Davenport. I'm going to go ahead and just read this from the book. Drawing thousands of colonists to Boston Commons day after day, Davenport declared that the people should drink rat poison rather than listen to corrupt, unconverted clergy. Claiming that Davenport's followers were idle or ignorant persons and those of the lowest rank, Boston officials finally called a grand jury into sessions to silence him on the charge of having said that Boston's ministers were leading the people blindfold to hell. Davenport got in trouble. But he had a way with words. Now, while some folks, Davenport, were really, really raging against the established clergy, some folks were a little more moderate. We had folks like Tennant, who rather than splitting the denominations, were actually bringing them together. He reunited the New York and Philadelphia Presbyterians, who had split for some reason. This happens all the time. Churches split for various reasons. There was a big split among the Methodists about a decade back because apparently a group decided that it was cool for women to be preachers, and another big group in the Methodists decided that was a bad idea, and they had a huge falling out. So, welcome to the 21st century, guys. Anyway, even after all everything had died down, things in America were still pretty passionate when it came to religion. And we've had another Great Awakening since then, so yeah, it's pretty passionate. We got some weirdos calling for a third Great Awakening, but that's mostly the QAnon fellows and certain property moguls or Jesus come back and all that. So we'll just ignore them. I found this. So this is apparently supposed to be Whitefield. Says so right there. This image is also in the book. So to start explaining what's going on, the engraving satirizes George Whitefield and his followers, the title highlighting an eye disease that left Whitefield cross-eyed. They call him Dr. Squintum because he was cross-eyed. That's mean. I mean, that's just right off the bat kind of mean. The image shows an imp in fame hovering on either side of Whitefield's head. You can see there, like pumping something into his ear, I guess. The devil rakes in money below his podium. On the left, Whitefield's followers are seen with a prostitute, while other followers are shown shoving a mother and a child and taking food from a poor woman. You know, some folks didn't like Whitefield very much. And this guy wasn't even Davenport. So, yeah. Political cartoons of the day were something else. Yeah, we got 5 minutes left, and I'm not going to get into political stuff. So, you folks come up and give me your test, and I will see y'all next Monday. I almost said Wednesday. Not Wednesday. We're here next Monday.